Welcome to the Latino Business Report, where we uncover the stories of extraordinary individuals. Today we honor the legendary Green Beret Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez, also known by his call sign, TANGO MIKE MIKE. While many of you know his name, the full extent of his incredible story is often untold. Roy Benavidez's acts of bravery and sacrifice during the Vietnam War make even the most dramatic war films seem pale in comparison. He stands as America's most famous Hispanic war hero. In this episode, we talk with Sergeant Benavidez's daughter, Yvette Benavidez Garcia, and William Surkey, an associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania and author of the upcoming book, The Ballad of Roy Benavidez, The Life and Times of America's Most Famous Hispanic War Hero. Orphaned as a child and a high school dropout, Roy Benavidez defied the odds, enlisting in the Texas Army National Guard at 17 and later joining the Army Special Forces. His story is one of unparalleled courage and perseverance. Join us as we explore the life of a true American hero. Check the podcast notes for links, videos, books, and articles, and other sources that detail the remarkable journey of Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez. Stay tuned for a tale of heroism that'll leave you inspired.
Welcome to the Latino Business Report. This podcast covers business, people, and issues of the day from a Latino perspective. The Latino Business Report is brought to you by TAMAC, the Texas Association of Mexican American Chambers of Commerce. TAMAC is the leading Hispanic business organization in Texas since 1975. Now for your host, J.R. Gonzalez.
Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about a person everybody should know about. And to make sure we know about him well, we have his daughter here, which is Yvette Benavidez Garcia. Yvette, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you for making the time being here. And we also have the other person we have on the podcast today is going to be William Surkey. William is the author of the new book that is about to come out called The Ballad of Roy Benavidez, The Life and Times of America's Most Famous Hispanic War Hero. William, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, thank both of you for making the time to being here. Let's just go ahead and roll up our sleeves and get into it. Roy Benavidez, Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez, Green Beret. A lot of you have heard the story, but in my opinion and the opinion of others, probably even on this podcast, not enough people have heard about Roy. Roy was truly an American hero. He's an icon in the Latino community and somebody who deserves respect and has really, really earned a lot of recognition, not only in military history, but also for civilian history as well. So let's go ahead and get into it. William, let me start off with you. You have written a book, and the title is The Ballad of Roy Benavidez, The Life and Times of America's Most Famous Hispanic War Hero. Where was the interest? Why write a book on Roy?
So I first came across Roy. I forget exactly how I got to a YouTube channel where he was giving a speech. And I've told Yvette this, I think, in the past. But somehow I stumbled upon this in 2005 or 2006. And so I graduated high school in 2000, and I went to a place where a lot of young men, especially young men and women, joined the military in order to put themselves through college, in order to pursue a better opportunity in life than what they thought was presented to them straight out of high school. And the military was the pathway to doing that. And then, of course, 15 months after I graduated, 9/11 happened, and so I knew a lot of people that fought in the war on terror. And around 2005, 2006, one of my good friends from high school had been killed. Don Oakes, who the book is also dedicated to. But then I had a couple other people from high school that came back from the war, and they just had very difficult lives because of the nature of the war. And it really just struck me with how effusive America was in celebrating its veterans. How could it be that so many veterans, were committing suicide and so many veterans were struggling so dearly, like some of the friends that I had? And I came across Roy's story as I was really struggling with this as a young man, with so many people and thinking about the wars and everything else. And what really grabbed me at first about Roy's story was learning about him receiving the Medal of Honor in 1981, but then also the story about him getting kicked off of the disability rolls in 1983. And so the public celebration versus the public policies didn't really match up in that case. And I thought that really reflected so much of what I was seeing going on with my generation. And that's what really captured me in the first place. And the book became something else entirely. But ultimately, that's how I walked into it. And I think it's really important to share that I'm of the War on Terror generation because that framed that whole perspective for me. I don't think I would have been as attached to this story if not being part of that generation, having so many people I went to high school with go on and serve.
You said something that I think is an interesting point to talk about. Here it is, Roy Benavidez, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, and then he gets kicked off the rolls of what?
He was receiving SSDI, disability insurance, and yeah, he got a notification in early 1983 that he was going to lose his disability insurance, and it was a very cold letter. It said things like, "We've determined, without an examination, we've determined that you can lift 25 pounds and work X number of hours a week. So we're terminating your benefits." And of course, he's a national hero at this point. He just received the Medal of Honor about 2 years before. And so it was a huge national story. And I didn't even realize what a big deal this was nationally until I started researching the book. But that really struck me because that's not what, America said it was going to do for its veterans. And then here we have this very famous veteran being told that the wounds that he incurred while performing the act that he, for which he was honored, weren't enough to, qualify him for disability benefits.
And if that's happening to somebody like him, you can only imagine how many other people it's affecting, and how many people.
A lot of the other people that it affected wrote to Roy Benavidez directly, and that all became part of a huge wave to try and restore the disability benefits, not only for Roy but other veterans as well.
We're going to put a pin on that, William, and I want to get back to that subject because that's an interesting one that's occurring, that has occurred and still continue to occur. Our veterans are not getting the attention, the time, and the services that they need. It's a travesty. I mean, this is the United States of America. We should be taking care of our own, especially of our veterans who have given so much. Let's jump over to Yvette. Yvette, I can't even begin to imagine. How old were you when your dad received the Congressional Medal of Honor?
I was about 11 years old when my dad received the medal. So, I remember being there. I remember the pomp and circumstance. I remember the day. But you have to understand, I was young, and as with time comes, your memory doesn't really recognize or understand why your dad is receiving, the accolades that he's receiving. So from the time I became an adult and after my father's death, I started a journey of seeking and knowing and learning all about my dad, like everybody else kind of was doing. So there are some things that I've learned along the way from him. Of course, I know a lot because I lived with him and he's my father. But at the time of him receiving the medal, I was still young, and impressionable.
Where are you in the line of kids? How many siblings do you have? And
I am the middle child, the one that is forgotten, as we say in my family.
Yeah, well, now that you're on this podcast, you'll be famous, by God. You won't be forgotten.
I'm the middle child.
Middle child. Yvette, I can only imagine that growing up, especially when you were young and your dad was overseas in Vietnam, so he wasn't home a lot. Did when he did return, and you got to know him a little bit better, how was he? I mean, he went through, he went through hell and back so many times. Yet everything. So
I was not born when my dad did his tours in Vietnam, and so I was born after he came back, obviously. And then when he retired in San Antonio and moved the family to El Campo, that's kind of like what I remember the most. But as an educator and teaching my students and my fourth graders at the time when I was teaching fourth grade, they always wanted to learn and know more about my dad. They knew who my dad was, obviously. But there were no books written about him that I felt comfortable referring to them, because most of the books that my dad had either co-authored or that were written about him had some specific language that my dad did not approve of, the harsh, the bad words. So I never felt quite comfortable referring my students to any books. So we were kind of like forced to watch videos that were created of him, like on YouTube and stuff. And it wasn't until I would show these videos of my dad that it really came into my mind that had my dad not lived through the Vietnam War, had he died and succumbed to his injuries, then I would not obviously have been born. So that's when I really started to think and recognize that obviously I have a purpose in this world. And because of my father's passing at the time, I thought, this is the purpose that I'm meant to probably be here on earth for, is to help my father's legacy. And so that's when I started, doing social media on him so that people could recognize and remember who he was and be inspired and encouraged because of what he did.
Where can you find out more about your dad on social media? What are some of the platforms that you have, and what are the names?
So I have a YouTube channel that I administer, Facebook that I administer, Instagram, and I have put a couple of things on TikTok because I know that's the social media craze that a lot of kids are on. Whether or not they're seeing it, I don't know. But I'm mostly on Facebook and YouTube.
Okay. And what's the name, and how do they find it? Is it under Roy Benavidez?
So they could just, it's Tango Mike Mike, which is my father's call sign, Roy P. Benavidez.
Tango Mike Mike. William, you want to jump in here on this one? What does Tango Mike Mike stand for, that call sign that he has?
Mike Mike was the call sign that he used second tour while stationed in Vietnam.
And you know what it stands for?
Oh, I think Yvette would be better positioned to say that than me.
It stands for That Mean Mexican. And of course, he was anything to us, his family, anything other than mean. But yeah.
Tango Mike Mike, That Mean
Tango
Mexican.
Mike Mike.
That's your dad went through so much, I believe. And William, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going through memory here. I believe that once he was examined and got back and was in the hospital, they counted like 40 injuries that he had sustained. From gunshots to stabs, to bayonet wounds, to shrapnel. I mean, the guy was pretty beat up, and on his flight back, when they finally evac'd him out of there, he was holding his own intestines in his stomach, as they were medevacing him out of there. I mean, that is one. I don't know about mean, but he's definitely tough. I mean, yeah. that guy just epitomized in the fact that he was Green Beret Special Forces, definitely lived up to the name. And there were so many people. I remember growing up. I'm obviously a little bit older than you, probably a lot older than you. But anyway, I grew up on military bases. Dad was military, and I remember hearing the story about Roy Benavidez when I was very, very young. And it is always every Veterans Day, every Memorial Day. I don't know, my personal Facebook pages, I'm always doing something about your dad, just a tribute, because he's definitely iconic, definitely somebody who needs to be remembered. And I think in the Latino community, he was definitely somebody that a lot of our next generation of young Latinos and Hispanics that may not be aware of some of the things that people like your dad went through and sacrificed for him is very notable.
And it's inspiring to know that, we have, as Latinas and Latinos, that we have somebody to look up to, because we're always looking and grasping for somebody that we can relate to. And so my dad's story, I'm very appreciative when people share it and when people do seek him out, and or like William, come across a YouTube video and or a Facebook post that has been posted on him, and then they share it. That's how his legacy continues, by sharing and by speaking his name and by telling his story and by not forgetting. Definitely
not forgetting. William, take this question here. You I'm assuming I haven't had a chance. I mean, I pre-ordered your book. I haven't had a chance to get a copy and read it yet. It's coming out. When's the book coming out? June something?
Book is officially coming out on June 11th,
June
so a
11th.
couple Tuesdays from now, but it's available for pre-order wherever books are sold.
Okay, and we'll remind people of that towards the end. But William, Roy's childhood. Can you kind of describe that for the listeners?
Yeah. So one of the things that this book does that no one's done before is this is a full biography of Roy Benavidez. There's been so many books that talked about his life, and his own book, he talked about his childhood a lot, and I learned an incredible amount from that. But nobody's really done sort of the context of what was going on with other Hispanics and what was going on with America early on in his life. And then almost all the stories end essentially with 1981 when he receives the Medal of Honor. They don't go up until his death and even beyond. He lived another 17 years after receiving the Medal of Honor. And so Roy grew up in Jim Crow era Texas. And for a lot of people, Jim Crow suggests sort of the black and white racial segregation. And my last book, and what I grew up as a historian studying, was civil rights in Mississippi. And it was black, white, and there's no blurring of that line. Jim Crow era Texas was a bit different for people like Roy Benavidez. Like there were just different rules, and they could change all the time. So it was a little bit, I was trying to capture the essence of basically where Hispanic Americans fit into the American economy. What were their contributions in the late 1800s, early 1900s? Where did Roy's family come from? Why was Roy's family poor? They were poor sharecroppers. He lost both his parents at a young age. But then I also wanted to talk about what was going on in his psychology. So the one thing that helped me a lot was knowing about like some of the literature about what happens to kids that grow up in those stressful environments where race is around them all the time and where they get dinged all the time for race. So for example, unlike Mississippi or a place where black and white segregation was a pretty clean line, where Roy grew up, like he went to school with white kids, but he couldn't always use the water fountain, right? Or he could work in a restaurant, but he couldn't eat in the front, go through the front door to eat. Little things like that. He could go to the movie theater, but he couldn't sit in, down by the screen. So things like that. And they clearly stayed with him, those experiences, throughout the course of his life, because he talked about them so often as an adult, and he wrote about them so often in the final book that he wrote in his life in the 1990s. And so Roy experienced a lot of segregation, and that made him really bitter. He experienced the loss of both of his parents, but then he also experienced growing up among a group of people who were clearly at the bottom rung in society. In the book, I explain why Hispanic Americans were at the bottom rung of society in that point in time, but Roy didn't quite know that. And without that sort of equipment to really understand why people like you and your family are at that lower level, the natural explanation is just natural selection. Well, white people are better. They're just more industrious. They've worked harder. And that was just a myth. But it was something that Roy had to deal with throughout his entire life, trying to work his way up from sort of this bottom ladder of society, and then becoming this prominent American hero. And his path was completely unique. But that's ultimately what a lot of this book was about. How do you emerge from being born into that station to becoming such a prominent American figure in his own time?
Now you captured my attention again, William. So very briefly, what was during that time, as you describe as the Jim Crow era in the South or in Texas? So what was it like for Hispanics, Mexican Americans during that time period? Why were we at the bottom of the rung?
Okay, well, so one of the things that I do in the book is I do a lot of genealogy for Roy's family. So I, like many people, assumed that somewhere along the line, very close to Roy, there was an immigration story, because that's how so many Hispanic families are talked about. But Roy, Yvette, and Roy, their family goes back 5 generations from Roy in Texas. Okay, they were among the pioneers of Texas while Texas was still a part of Mexico. Their ancestors fought to help free Texas from Mexico, largely over the issue of slavery, largely over the Mexican Constitution. But then after the revolution, all these white settlers poured in and all of a sudden Mexican Americans started to lose their land, and I go through this whole process, and that's exactly what happened with the Benavidez family. They lost their property through theft and grift around Victoria. They then moved to the area down around Hidalgo County, and the exact same thing happened another generation later. And ultimately, they went from owning over 4,000 acres and thousands of cattle in the 1860s to becoming sharecroppers within 2 generations. And I lay out how all those processes happened. It was this system meant to protect the wealth of Anglos over that of everybody else. And so one of the things that happened then as more Mexican Americans started, as Mexicans started moving in, all the Hispanics were kind of grouped as one, even the families like Roy's that had been there for generations and even had fought to liberate Texas from Mexico. And so it was that sort of caste system that was created, not something that was natural at all, but it was created in the 1880s and 1890s. That's why people like him were so poor. And then we get a whole host of segregation laws and practices that say, okay, Mexican Americans, they can't go to this movie theater, or they can't go to that restaurant and things like that. And, the people that raised Roy, they just wanted to assimilate. They wanted to prove that they could belong. They wanted to prove that they were Americans like everybody else. But then the Anglos on the other side of the coin resisted that assimilation. And probably the most striking example is the 1930 census, when Hispanic Americans were all listed as Mexican in the census. So Roy's family had been in Texas for 100 years. And there they are in the census of 1930 listed as Mexican, even though they had fought for the Texas Revolution. So, I outline all of that in the first couple of chapters. And then, Roy, because his family was so poor, they were extremely hardworking. They were migrant laborers. So they went on the road looking for work. They went up to Colorado and they picked sugar beets. So I went up to Colorado and did a lot of research there about Hispanic Americans that came from Texas, were recruited by the tens of thousands, and they got on the roads from like the Grapes of Wrath era and went up and picked sugar beets. And then they went all around Texas and picked cotton, because as you know, the cotton season is very different depending on where you are in Texas.
Right.
And they worked their butts off. And so I try to really center their story and like what's happening with America during the Great Depression of the 1930s, during World War II of the 1940s. And then we get into the Hispanic World War II heroes. And those were the people that, when Roy was at 10 or 11 years old, those are the people that really were the big fish in Hispanic American communities, the men that went and fought and then came back and tried to fight for their rights. And that's where the American GI Forum comes from. LULAC really picked up steam.
Right.
So I'm trying to tell a bigger story about Hispanic Americans in Texas, but using Roy as sort of a lens to do that early on in the book.
Absolutely, and thank you for doing that. I mean, sincerely, it is a story that needs to be told over and over and over, because a lot of folks just do not realize it. And I think the fact that so many families, and my family was definitely the same. It's interesting that one day we're landowners and ranchers, and after a war we seem to be squatters and cattle thieves, even though we were here,
right,
generations before the white settlers started coming in. But
imagine if he had been around in that era, 5 generations before, what he could have done to eradicate that, to change that, But moving forward, when we get our youth and other people to read this book and understand and know and learn, then they can understand that it doesn't have to be that way.
It's
nothing
true.
Nothing in life has to be the way that it is, as long as you're an advocate for yourself and you help to fight for change.
Absolutely. And your dad was definitely one, not only to fight for change, but one, just his love for fellow man and just duty and honor is unparalleled. I mean, I never had the opportunity to meet him personally, but everything I've read and researched, he just seems as somebody that was just truly not only an icon. I mean, he represented, I think, the best of what this country had to offer, and also represented the best of, and with pride, the best of the best, not only from America, but the fact that he was Hispanic, even more so. And Yvette, your dad was really not educated. He dropped out, 7th, 8th grade from school?
Yeah, he didn't have that high of an education, but even though he dropped out, he educated himself. During because he was, like William talks about, he had to help his family earn a living, and they were migrant workers, and so they were moving from city to state looking for jobs, and he was just not able to get the education that he deserved and needed, because of the job that he was doing and working and leaving.
Right.
So yeah, he dropped out about the age of eighth grade. And but after that, he knew that he wasn't going to be able to make a life for himself and his new pursuant, which was my mother. He was dating my mom, and he wanted a life with her, and he knew that he wasn't going to be able to make a family life with the education that he had and or the jobs that he was taking. So he wanted to pursue something that could get him an education and further that.
And the military,
so he joined
was an option.
The military.
And William, I'm sure you found that in your research that there's a lot of families, a lot of Latino families in Texas along the South that did the same thing. They used the military as a way to get out of the colonias, get out of the barrios, and improve their lives. It was a way out.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I try to do in the book, so the context is what's happening with Hispanic Americans writ large, but the other context is the global context. And so he joined the military at a young age. He joined the National Guard first. He was 16 years old. But the Korean War was going on when he joined the military. And everybody knew that there was not everybody, but the American administration knew there was a huge problem coming in Vietnam. Right? There's all these other problems in different places where Roy was stationed, especially Berlin. So he's not only joining the military to pursue a better life, he's also joining a military at a moment when people are actively thinking there could be a World War III and that American troops were stationed all over the globe. By the mid-1960s, America had more soldiers stationed over more parts of the globe than any country in the history of the world. 850,000 soldiers stationed all across the globe. That had never happened in world history. And so a huge part of the timing is this global Cold War that he then becomes sucked up in. And that's just an incredible part of the story, the places that he goes. I mean, he's in Berlin before the wall goes up. He's there when all these hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers are there right across the border, and tensions could not possibly be any higher. So it's really an incredible story about this young boy from Texas and the global conflict that he's also entering.
The global conflict, and let's be clear. Just because he was uneducated did not mean he was not smart. I mean, he was sharp as a tack.
I know means right, exactly.
And what was he? Special Forces. He was one of he thinks he was cross trained as a linguist specialist. I mean, he spoke multiple languages.
Yes, he did. My family kind of has this debate on whether or not he actually knew 14 different languages, but my father talks about the many languages that he did learn, and he knew them well enough to get by. So, he had to. He had to learn the languages of the countries that he was visiting. So, and what's even more fascinating is that my dad had a traumatic brain injury before he even entered the first tour. So, here's this man who has 9 lives. And like William talks about the global issue that's going on, but just his internal issues that are going on, with everything that he's had to combat from the point of birth to where he gets to in the war. But yeah, I mean, for my dad to go through these different traumatic experiences in his life and then to come out knowing and learning, weaponry, languages, everything that he needed to learn for special forces is just incredible and a true testament of, your will, your determination, the power of your mind and what it can do when you want to accomplish something.
How tall was your dad?
He was 5'8".
5'8". Okay, military special forces, well trained. I mean, it's not like he was a huge man, but he was pound for pound. In fact, he was the toughest SOB out there on the field. And as we look at this, somebody to be remembered, and the fact that we have books out, multiple books, And William, thank you so much. I'm anxious to read this book from your perspective. I've learned a few things talking to you on this podcast already, and I want to continue another conversation with you later on. But as you told us, William, what do you find some of the most interesting points of the book? Some of the stuff that you researched.
I think, one way to put this is that I think a lot of people have been interested in what's happened with the fighting with Roy Benavidez and what he did with his body. I'm so much more interested in his mind. I could tell from the moment I first saw him speak that he was really, really brilliant. And I'm the type of historian that I don't think that all working class brown and black people are unintelligent. I know that there are conditions that they are not as educated, but he's really, really brilliant. And I think that comes through in the book. And I talk about the way that he then goes about giving speeches when he becomes really famous in the 1980s. But one thing that I will highlight that this conversation has been making me think of is the final chapter of the book, and it ends with his passing and funeral. But and Yvette played a big role in this, but in his archives are the letters that he received from across the world. And I was always so interested in, there's all these different military heroes. Like, what is it about this man that drew people to him? But then when you really get into the archives, like what people are saying to him, there's all sorts of a range. You get third grade students writing and saying, "You're my hero. This is what America means because of you. Thank you for what you did. You're an inspiration." There's that. But then there's also people just wanting his autograph and stuff like that, like a lot of celebrities get. But the ones that really got me were some of the people that he exchanged letters with that were asking him for advice or asking him to speak, at their weddings, or just like there was an eighth grade girl I remember whose mother was killed by a drunk driver, and she like wrote him a letter asking to, how do I deal with this? Can you give me some advice about how to do that? And he wrote to her. Like there was a kid in Alabama whose father was sent off to Korea and stationed there. And he wrote to Roy, and the father wrote to Roy also separately. But the kid wrote to Roy and was asking, for advice about how do I handle this transition in my family? And my father's not going to be with us anymore. And Roy wrote to the kid and like helped bring him comfort about what his father was doing and what it meant in the world. And the father wrote to Roy separately and said, "Thank you so much for writing to my son." So it was all those sort of like little interactions like that. Like, what does it mean in America to be a hero? Like, why are people so inspired by this particular story in a war that the United States didn't exactly win? So those sorts of questions, like how people reacted to him, is something that a lot of people have studied. But I thought it was so interesting to sort of flip it around also and think about how he reacted to them. And like, why was he giving all that advice? And then ultimately, why were they turning to him for advice and not just, celebrating him as a war hero? But there's
And
all
he
sorts of different ways in which he became famous and interacted with folks that I thought were really compelling.
he was personal like that, and a lot we still, or I still get messages from people across the world who just want to tell me, I met him back in the 1980s, or I met him, whatever, and how they say he came and I had a couple of beers with him, or I was his escort when he came down and we got to have dinner, or we talked on the way. And it's always how my dad was really took the time and was personable with people. Didn't treat them as if he was bigger or better. He treated them with respect and as if it was just those two people in the room. And that's what I mean. My dad just wanted to be up on that level with everybody. He didn't want people to think that he was any different than anybody else.
Just keep it
What he
real.
had to do was his duty.
Yeah.
He was trained to do that. It was love for his fellow men, love for his country, but he was no different than you and I.
I bet you if social media would have been around back then, your dad probably had more followers than Taylor Swift.
Yes, for sure.
Without a doubt. And no wardrobe malfunction. Let me. I know the question. It begs the question. So why isn't there a movie out on this yet, Yvette or William? Somebody.
That's just like the $1 million question. I ponder that all the time, and I don't even know if it's something for me to ponder. I'm a firm believer that it's going to happen when it happens. But, right after my dad passed away, he was really good friends with a particular person who was famous in that time frame, Hispanic. And this person got the life rights and sat on it for about 15 years. And I don't know why nothing ever transpired. I don't know if it was for lack of them pushing it forward or what, but just, that's neither here nor there anymore. Right before my mother passed away in 2019, she sold the life rights to somebody, and they have had it since. But nothing has really come to fruition from it. They have about 2 more years on their contract before the contract expires. And so we're hopeful that within the next 2 years that something will come out of this. I don't know if it's because Hollywood doesn't want another war movie. I don't know if it's, I would hope that it's not because of lack of effort on their part. But I don't know why it just hasn't resonated with Hollywood yet that this movie needs to come to fruition.
Well, it is a complicated question. There's probably dozens of reasons that out there, and many we may not even be aware of. But it's a story that needs to be told. William, thank you so much for writing this book. Like I said, I cannot wait.
If I could just add, so Roy trying to get the movie made and get his story out there is a huge part of the book. So I tell this story. It's largely in chapter. It's in the penultimate chapter, but it's a very big part of what his life was involved with in the late 1980s, and he definitely thought it should be a movie, and he was definitely working to do that, and I tell that story in the book. And I think Hispanics are vastly underrepresented in the publishing industry and in Hollywood, and it's not just him. So I think it's also part of just that large fact too.
That is a whole series of podcasts on that subject. I mean, the underrepresentation of Latinos. I mean, it's unfortunately it's gotten to a result where to be noticed you almost have to be an independent filmmaker, some of these indie films, and doing some stuff on their own. But that's just it. Our community needs a voice. We need to tell our stories. We need to get the message out there. If not, it's going to be forgotten. And if we don't do it, who will? So you're right. It's very important that we get these messages out there. And your dad, Yvette, was he's a hero. He was definitely a hero. And to the point, as Williams, you said, I think that his courage, his bravery, and what he accomplished on the battlefield was one to get people's attention and recognition, but him as a human being and as a person and what he fought for, socially, just for humanity, to make sure that people were treated equally and stuff. I'd be real interested to see what your dad's position would be, Yvette, on border issues right now with all this rhetoric going back and forth that, people from other countries and immigrants are nothing but criminals and cartel and drug dealers, and they're just here to rape our wives and steal our jobs. It's crazy, but we need people to rally behind like your dad. We're going to talk about the book here in a little bit one more time, and definitely, folks, if you go to the podcast notes, I'll put a link of where you can pre-order it or get it. But Yvette, what other stuff is going on now? I understand that your dad there's a foundation in your dad's name?
So we do have a scholarship that our family and gracious donors throughout the world who have sent in money help fund, but it's at El Campo High School, which is the high school that is in the hometown that we live in, that my dad retired to. So we do have a scholarship in his name. We have had it for the last 23 years. Since my dad's passing, a little bit after his passing, we started it. It's in his memory. We try to fund as many students as possible. So we do have that. Thanks be to God, it's always been able to be funded. So if anybody is interested in helping, they can certainly. We'll leave the address. Our high school, local high school, is the one who takes care of all the money that comes in, and they distribute it. So they're in charge of it. We do have, obviously, William's book that he wrote that's coming out on June the 11th, The Ballad of Roy Benavidez. Of course, we have my children's book that I wrote a couple years ago for not only our school-age children, 2nd grade through 7th grade, but those young at heart who struggle with reading long books. I wrote it for those younger students in mind so that they could just get the gist of who my dad was, what he stood for, what he was about. We have that, and of course the movie is in the works. I don't know. Is there anything else, William? trying to think.
Oh, the only thing I would add would be the Army is doing those Medal of Honor series graphic novels, and there was one of those about him that's really good too.
Yes, and that's I do have a sample of that I can show, and we'll leave the link on who you can write to get a free copy.
Okay, we'll put all this in the podcast notes. So if you're listening, just go to the description of the podcast, and then under there will be the rest of the notes, and we'll put links to all this stuff. Guys,
but I think his legacy has we've made it a point, our family, to remember my father and to get his story out there. We don't want people to forget about him because he is such an icon. He's a legend in the military community, but we want to keep his story alive, and so that's why I do the social media on him, and I try to post as much as possible. I do have something. It just reminded me. So next March of 2025, the National Medal of Honor Museum will be up and running in Arlington, Texas. That is near Dallas, and we're actually our family is going to be there next week to tour the site. But they are showcasing about 5 Medal of Honor recipients, and Dad was chosen as one of them for his story to be told. So his actual medal is going to be on loan for anywhere from 5 to 10 years. I don't know the longevity of it, but his actual medal, which has been at the Ronald Reagan Museum in Simi Valley in California, is going to be flown down and will be on site at the museum for people to see, and some other artifacts that our family has loaned the museum will be there. So millions of people will get to tour the museum when it opens next March of 2025, and they'll be able to actually see his medal.
Super. Thanks for sharing that with us. Yvette, where's your dad buried?
He's buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, Texas, and my mom is buried with him.
Outstanding. So he didn't end up in Arlington?
He did not. Before he passed, we did have this conversation, and from what I remember, it would have been an honor for him to be there. But in true Roy Benavidez fashion, he was thinking about his family, and he didn't want to be far from his family.
Stay close.
He wanted to be in an area that we could come and travel to and visit him as often as we needed to. So San Antonio was the place.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I tell you what, one of the projects I do is I head up an organization, and it is a leadership training program called Leadership Texas, and it's with it's not a emerging leaders program. It's people that have established. We have PhDs. We got some attorneys. We got very, very accomplished professional Latinos in there, Latinos and Latinas. Let me make sure we're clear on that. That are very successful in business, and this is a program to increase and try to take their leadership skills to the next level. 2 classes ago, I actually showed one of the videos of your dad, Roy Benavidez. I go, this is a story you guys need to know about, because I'll make reference to it every now and then. I said, just let me show you the video. And at the end of that video, half of the class were in tears. I mean, both men and women were they were very touched in the story. And we have some that were inspired. One guy goes, well, I'm going to name my next racehorse after Roy. And I go, okay.
That's awesome.
And then people were going around going, Tango Mike Mike, Tango Mike Mike. And I go, well, I'm glad it left an impression on you. But it's an impressive story, and it resonates well with a lot of people, and it's something that could definitely be. I never get tired of hearing it. I watch some of those videos.
I don't either, and I don't ever get tired of speaking about it. And when I'm reading William's book, I just got it about a week and a half ago. It brings me to tears every chapter, because I can feel the passion that William took to write it, and I'm very appreciative of it. And I'm just appreciative of everybody who I come in contact with, who you can just tell they have such a love and admiration for my father. It's overwhelming to witness that. And there's just so much room for improvement with everything that my dad stood for that we could just explode on. So I'm going to sit back and wait for it to happen, because there's so many avenues. There's more scholarships that I know that we can give. And West Point, in relation to what you just talked about, has a Benavidez leadership team that they've created. And so every year they have men and women who come through from West Point who take the leadership program. And it's just incredible the things that are created in his honor, in his name. And I mean, the sky's the limit. So we're just going to wait back and enjoy the ride, and wait for people to bring it to us, and let's move this. Let's explode on this. This is great.
Yvette, I've said it before, and I'm going to say it right now on this podcast. Just enlist me in the Roy Benavidez Army. Okay, I'm ready to do whatever duty needs to get your dad's name out in a story where more people can hear about it. Where more people can learn about him and the story and the things he stood for. So, Yvette, thank you very much, and we're here to help. And anytime you want to come back and talk about him, you're welcome. We'll definitely do that. William, any closing comments? Tell us one more time where we can get the book, and any of your closing thoughts before we end this podcast, sir.
So the book is available wherever books are sold. Obviously, a lot of people use Barnes & Noble or Amazon or Goodreads or anything like that. It'll be out on June 11th, so a good Father's Day present, also a good pre-4th of July present. I'll be in El Campo on July 1st at the Public Library, and I will also be in San Antonio on July 5th at the Twig at 5:30.
Okay. I'm going to definitely, if not both of those locations, I'm definitely going to make one of them. I look forward to meeting you in person, William. And I'm going to bring my copy of the book so you can autograph it for me, sir. And I'm going to keep that book. I'm going to keep that book so Yvette, si Dios quiera, I get to meet you in person one of these days. I want you to sign it as well.
Absolutely.
Guys, okay, besides that, okay, Roy Benavidez, guys. Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez, Special Forces. An amazing person. The book name, once again, is The Ballad of Roy Benavidez, the life and times of America's most famous Hispanic war hero. And my favorite, it's a great call sign, Tango Mike Mike. So with that, everybody be safe out there. Drive carefully. Remember who you are. Be proud of who you are. And we'll see you next time.